Estou passando nesse podcast para dividir uma informação que fez toda a diferença na minha vida. Quer fazer pós-graduação, mas tá impossível correr de um lugar para o outro?
Pois é, ainda mais com o trânsito.
Então você precisa conhecer a educação à distância do Senac. Sabia que é nota máxima no MEC? E tem diversos cursos de pós-graduação para te levar ainda mais longe. 100% online, sem necessidade de TCC e com acesso direto a todos os professores.
Ah, saber isso fez diferença sim.
Inscreva-se já na pós-graduação EAD. Quer saber? Senac EAD.
From Wall Street to the White House, this is the Larry Kudlow Show.
Welcome back, folks. We welcome to the show Steve Forbes, dear friend, leader of free market economics for so many years and decades, former presidential candidate, chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media. Steve's latest book is Inflation, What It Is, Why It's Bad, and How to Fix It. Steve, welcome. Thank you very, very much for this. On a Saturday.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
You're great. You're a prince. You know, we were talking about the politics of Robert Kennedy endorsing Trump earlier in the show, but I wanted to raise with you, have some fun, but it's important. He had some very serious criticisms of the Democratic Party, and you are a foreign policy expert as well as domestic economics. Here's what he said. We've pushed Russia into a disastrous alliance with China and Iran. We're closer to the brink of nuclear exchange than any time since 1962. And then the second part, Steve, our moral authority and our economy are in shambles, and the war gave rise to the emergence of the BRIC countries, which now threatens to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency. This is a first-class calamity for our country. He's a serious guy, Robert Kennedy. If you know him, I know him. We had dinner a couple months ago with Laffer and others. You might have been at that dinner. I don't recall. But anyway, what do you think about what he's saying? We pushed Russia into a disastrous alliance with China and Iran, closer to the brink of nuclear exchange than any time since '62, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
First, before getting to that, I think that underscores why Donald Trump, in the next few weeks, must give a very serious address on foreign policy. You know, he's made mention on the campaign trail World War III, but it almost sounds like a throwaway line. He's got to give context to that so people understand how dangerous this world is. It's the most dangerous situation since World War II. It is reminiscent of the 1930s. Russia and China have been getting together for years. I don't think we so much as pushed them as we allowed it to happen, that they both saw a huge opening, that not only where Kennedy is right, that we're losing our moral authority, but also the world does not see us as supplying a security umbrella against the bad guys in the world. For example, China's been bullying the Philippines. The Philippines wants our help. The Philippines wants to be aligned with us, but they don't see us providing any real help. And the Chinese said, we'll stop bullying you if you come into agreement with us. We have China putting in a major port in Peru, of all places. We've got the threat in Mexico of becoming a one-party state again, and they're making goo-goo eyes at the Chinese. So in terms of those two bad guys, Putin has been aggressive for a long time, but because we've cut our military, and more importantly, we have no strategy in the world today. Unlike post-World War II, we completely revamped our approach to the world because of changed circumstances. We've had major changed circumstances in recent years, and the United States has not responded. What we're experiencing today, Larry, I think Kennedy is putting his finger on it, is that we not only have no real strategy, but we have a bankruptcy of leadership, not rising to the occasion as we did in the early 80s, not just with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but with people like Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, who courageously stood up to the Soviet Union, helped win the Cold War by some critical moves he made in the early 80s, or after World War II with George Marshall and others, so that we had set the basis for winning the Cold War. So I think Donald Trump must make a long, serious address. So when he talks about the dangerous world, people have context for it and understand where he's coming from, and that will set the foundation for change come next January.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. He's going to give, I guess, a couple of economic speeches, Detroit Economics Club and New York Economics Club, as he did back in 2016. But I'm not aware of a foreign policy speech, but I'm going to pass that along. I think it's a great idea, important idea.
And it also gets to what's happened to our defenses. We've all made the point that the shocking thing is with this more dangerous world is that we're cutting our budget in real terms on defense. And maybe he should think about, maybe a campaign you can't do it, but think about, we need shipbuilding. Why aren't we using the South Koreans who have the best shipbuilding yards in the world to start creating vessels? Getting our allies, not just to spend, but to start creating the weaponry that together we can make clear to Russia and China, you're not going to take over the free world, where the free world has to kowtow because you're seen as the power and the United States is shrinking and moving away.
Your earlier point, you put a lot on the table. I want to get to it. Your earlier point, we always think of China, and they are threatening Taiwan without question, but they are also threatening the Philippines, which is a longtime ally and a strategic point in the whole Pacific theater, right? You look at those shipping lanes there, and they're bullying the Philippines almost on a daily basis. So I totally agree. The other thing, Steve, is China's coming to Latin America. They're big. They're big.
Doctrine.
Right. Exactly. I knew you. They're coming here. They're heavily into a number of the South American and Latin American and the canal. All right, the Panama Canal, for heaven's sakes.
Well, that's right. And we've been seen as passive, and that's one of the reasons why you have governments in Latin America, except for Argentina, and hopefully our friend there, Milei, will get the currency right so those free market reforms will truly flourish as never before and be a counterpoint to what you see in the rest of that continent. But you have governments there feeling they got to move and cozy up with China because China's the rising power. And that's why it was so crazy the Biden administration, and Kamala Harris, of course, went along with it when they were browbeating Saudi Arabia in 2021, poo-pooing the Abraham Accords. And then suddenly they woke up. Iran's got bad designs on that neighborhood. We better not be so nasty to the Saudis. There's not been a real seriousness in this administration, and she should be called to account for it, and she should explain. How are you going to undo the damaged situation we have in the world today?
Well, look, at the speech at the DNC convention, she talked about how she would have a strong American military and a strong American military presence. Well, it's just not true because of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan...
Well, exactly. Who was in charge in the last 3.5 years? Not to mention the economy and everything else, the border. It's almost laughable if it wasn't so tragic in its consequences.
We didn't leave Afghanistan. We fled Afghanistan. And actually, the Joint Chiefs, as weak as they seem to be sometimes, the Joint Chiefs opposed it. And as you know, we left the Bagram Air Base and we left $85 billion worth of military equipment. And that, I think, Steve, and I think that links to Putin and Ukraine. And
Absolutely.
Also Chinese mischief, and also Iranian. They took a look at that, and they said, America's not going to be America anymore, and took advantage of us.
And what has to be understood, too, is this just didn't start with Joe Biden. This started with Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. And Biden was continuing Obama's policies, and we did have what you might call an interregnum with Donald Trump, but you've had now 12 years of a disastrous, almost anti-American foreign policy. It's unbelievable when you say it, but Barack Obama wanted Iran to be the dominant power in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. He thought that was the way he should move on it. That's why he did not support when the people rose up in 2009 to try to overthrow this odious regime, why he's given it billions of dollars, so is Joe Biden. It's perverse. And this lack of strategy, this lack of people feeling the U.S. is adrift, shrinking, that is giving the opening to these bad actors.
So one other point you raised on military spending. We have now the Biden-Harris budget moves defense spending as a share of GDP down to 2.7% in the 10-year window. We ought to be, I remember Reagan got it up to 6.5%. It should be, if it doesn't go back there, because you're talking about important things like shipbuilding, we can't have that. We've got to be boosting as a share of GDP. We should be boosting GDP, and that would throw off the revenues for defense. That was part of the Reagan solution, beat Gorbachev back. But I think right now, no one's paying attention to the decline in defense spending, as you say, in real terms after inflation and as a share of our economy. Those are both decent measures, and we're in the wrong direction.
And she should be asked why she stood by and let that happen. For example, the one thing that keeps China from invading now Taiwan is our nuclear-powered missile submarines. Don't hold me to the numbers, but I believe we're supposed to have 66 or something like that. Only 30 are operating right now because we don't have the means to keep them going. But the Chinese are moving on sophisticated submarine technology. But ask her, why did you gut the Navy? China's now, for the first time in 100 years, Larry, another nation has more warships than the United States. And why did she let that happen? And China's moving ahead. We're still cutting back naval ships. Basic questions like that. And see what kind of dreadful word salad she comes up with.
Well, that's, peace through strength. But you got to have strength.
Exactly.
You got to grow the economy. You got to allocate necessary resources to defense, as you say. And then we'll have peace. Because people, look, Machiavelli, better to be feared than loved. We've lost that whole idea. I think they feared Trump. I think Trump is somewhat ambiguous, but I think basically they really feared him. They wouldn't move against him.
Well, Trump would not have allowed, because he had Iran on its knees, would not have allowed Iran to sell $100 billion plus of oil to China,
right.
Which gave them the wherewithal to allow October 7th and all these dangerous proxies. One of the most outrageous things that Harris should be asked about, since freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation has been a bulwark of U.S. foreign policy for over 2 centuries, going back to the Barbary pirates. Why in the world have they allowed the Houthis, which are a tentacle of Iran, to close down a critical waterway? Why did you allow that to happen?
That's a good question. It's very good. Steve Forbes, you're going to join us. I got to take a commercial break, make a couple of bucks. I'd like to have you come back. RFK wants a strong dollar. Global reserve currency. I love that. We'll talk about that. I want to talk about his uncle's economic policies, which his father basically agreed with as well. Folks, we are talking to the great Steve Forbes, chairman and editor of Forbes Media, and his latest book is Inflation, What It Is, Why It's Bad, How to Fix It. I'm Kudlow. We'll be right back.
Larry Kudlow. Larry Kudlow. Now, back to the Larry Kudlow Show.
We are talking to the great Steve Forbes, chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media, and his most recent book is Inflation, What It Is, Why It's Bad, and How to Fix It. I want to remind people, Mr. Forbes ran effectively twice for the presidency of the United States, won several primaries, got a lot of votes, and helped to propagate not only his strong on defense views, which we just heard in the first segment, but also the flat tax rate view, which is also incredibly important. Steve, welcome. Interestingly, this is kind of after your heart and mine. Bob Kennedy yesterday, I'll quote it again, our moral authority and our economy are in shambles, and the war gave rise to the emergence of BRICS, so that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, which now threaten to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency. This is a first-class calamity for our country. I believe you would agree with that. I believe I would agree with that, and I believe I'm surprised it was in his statement. But this is something we talked about with Bob Kennedy when Laffer had his dinner a couple months ago. But, of course, as you know, his Uncle John F. Kennedy, who cut tax rates, first guy to do it since the 20s, would also maintain the dollar as good as gold. So I'm just going to unleash you on these points.
Well, he's exactly right. And in terms of the BRICS right now, in terms of real currency replacement, there's some splashy stuff, but they're going nowhere. But the people having doubts about the dollar, that is real. They keep using it because there's no other better alternative out there. They don't want to use the Chinese yuan. But if we continue to undermine our economy, then you are going to see currency chaos, the likes of which we saw in the 1930s. And that was one of the reasons why we had such a disastrous situation, which led to World War II. So we got to have a stable dollar. By the way, one of the things about the Federal Reserve, everyone's focusing, saying, oh, Powell's going to cut rates and he may cut more rates, blah, blah, blah. First of all, and this is a discussion for another time, he shouldn't be manipulating interest rates in the first place. But the fact of the matter is the Federal Reserve still believes that depressing the economy is the way you fight inflation. And not one time does he or any other central bank talk about a stable dollar, which he used to refer to as king dollar. And when you have a stable currency and an unleashed U.S. economy, the dollar is going to reign supreme because people want that. And we are still a nation of laws despite the huge assaults that we're undergoing today. And in terms of the Democratic Party, yes, Robert Kennedy is right. Ronald Reagan said it. Others have said it. The party left them. They didn't leave the party. And the need for a stable dollar, the need for tax cuts is very real. Democrats, younger ones, are just absolutely floored when you tell them that the big tax cuts of World War II started with John F. Kennedy proposing tax cuts in the early 60s. And by the way, Larry, as you point out in your book, his first round of tax cuts were business tax cuts. Remember the old investment tax spread? Yes,
100%. That's right.
So he got it, and he understood that when you have in terms of our security, you need a strong economy. And we should have learned from the 30s and the 70s, 1970s, when you have a weak economy, not only do we suffer, but the world suffers. And so these huge tax proposals that Kamala Harris has put out, including a wacky one taxing unrealized capital gains, you destroy capital, you destroy the creation of resources, and with a weak America, the world descends into chaos. So this has very real national security implications, not just GDP implications.
You know, Steve Forbes, let's just linger a moment on the question of the dollar and the currency. Right now, the Fed is moving to lower its interest rate targets, which neither of us really favor, but the price
of be in the business anyway, but anyway.
No, and Laffer agrees with that. But the price of gold has soared to over $2,500 an ounce.
Yes.
And the dollar index has now dropped back to around 100. I mean, the thing was about, 112, 113 a year ago. And the Federal Reserve doesn't, and as far as I know, Fed pays no attention to the value of the dollar, whether it's in relation to other currencies or in relation to some commodity benchmarks, which you've talked about, gold, or you could use a broad CRB, or all the above, as Wayne Angell and Manley Johnson did many years ago, Reagan appointees to the Fed. But that is completely missing. I mean, you're right. The Fed looks at the trade-off, this inaccurate trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and they're doing it again. They're worried about unemployment now, so they're going to start easing. But nary a word about the dollar. I have not read Powell's speech. I'll probably read it over the weekend. I'll bet you didn't mention the dollar at Jackson Hole.
No, and the other thing is we all focus on the federal funds rate, which, as we now know, is irrelevant because banks don't lend to each other since QE's created.
They have so much damn money, they don't need to.
And but one of the things they should cut, and wouldn't get much publicity, but would have a real impact, as you know, the Federal Reserve now pays interest on bank reserves, almost 5.5%, which is why we have what they call the inverted yield curve, short rates being higher than long rates, which is crazy. And it also hurts lending to small businesses. So while he may do 25 basis points on the meaningless federal funds rate, How about taking 100 or 200 basis points over your reserve interest payments, which would prompt lending? Get some money going to smaller businesses for their inventories and expansion and the like. And instead, they still hung up, as you point out, on this Phillips curve. Oh, we must depress the economy, not let it get too overheated, blah, blah, blah. Really bad stuff. They need to be challenged by the next president.
You know, $2,500 gold is a lot of money, Steve. I mean, look, we have gold. I have a valued gold sponsor for this show, and I'm happy to have them. But I'm just saying that's a very high price. The stock market's doing well, but, gold is outperforming stocks.
Yeah, it's a yellow light flashing.
Ah, there you go. Right. Good point.
The Fed, while they think they're conquering inflation by depressing the economy, they're setting up trouble in the future,
Great
just
point.
as they did in the 1970s.
The brilliant and encyclopedic Steve Forbes. Nobody better. Can't thank you enough. Talk soon. Folks, we're going to take a break, and then we'll do some stock market work after that. I'm Kudlow. Stick around.